שלום לכם. בשיעור שלנו היום אנחנו פוגשים אנשים שלא רואים את המדע כתחום תוכן שיש ללמד או להנחיל, אלא כהיבט בתרבות שלנו. מרק רוזן למשל, שנפגוש עכשיו, לקח את המאסטר שלו בפיזיקה ואת הדוקטורט שלו במתמטיקה שימושית מקמברידג' והקים את גרילה סיינס, ארגון שמטרתו לערב ולערבב את המדע עם אומנות, מוזיקה ומשחק. וכדי שנוכל להבין מה הוא מנסה להשיג בזה, נעבור עכשיו לאנגלית. Shalom and welcome to Mark Rosen, Associate Professor in the Department of Math and Science at Pratt Institute in New York, as well as Director and Co-founder of Guerrilla Science, an international organization dedicated to mixing science with art, music, and play. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Shalom.
Shalom. What is the main idea behind Guerrilla Science? How did it come about?
That's a great question. So Guerrilla Science started when I was in my early 20s in graduate school. I was a big fan of music festivals. I found them these very emancipatory places where you could be free. But I noticed, along with some co-founders, there wasn't a lot of science content at these places. It felt like science as a part of culture was actually entirely absent. So we started Guerrilla Science as a sort of proto TEDx style event at a music festival in the UK, and it had a lot of success. People seemed to really like it. So from there, we kind of launched this idea of taking science into the places and spaces that it was least expected. So these are places like music and art festivals, nightclubs, pop-up urban spaces, and it got a lot of traction. People seemed to really like it. So one of the examples that I'm fondest of is an installation that I did a few years ago at this big music festival in the Nevada desert in America called Burning Man. And at this place, we built a pop-up travel agency. So we built a travel agency that people could just walk by and, plan their vacations at. It's a bit of a retro feel. People plan their vacations online, but our parents' generation, they used to go into a shop. And so this travel agency was called the Intergalactic Travel Bureau. And the conceit of the storyline is that you're walking along, you pop into a travel agency and you meet a travel agent, and in a very straight-faced way, we sell you a vacation to another planet. So, let's just do an example. So, like, what sort of things do you like to do on your vacations?
Going to Mars, of course.
Right. So, obviously you can't go to Mars, but if, say, you liked doing hiking, you like going for a hike or some outdoor adventures, then I would recommend Mars. It's, it's nice and nearby. It only takes, a couple of months to get there. And the low gravity means it's nice and easy to backpack about, not too much weight.
But why is it so important to you to infuse science into a space that doesn't have science? So people went to Burning Man. They didn't intentionally want to see science there. They didn't think about science. Why do you come with your science to meet them there?
That's really interesting. So I see this as something of an equity and a democracy issue. So when most people leave school, they don't have much connection with science. That's mostly them done for the rest of their lives. And in a Western country, you might live for another 60, 70 years without any further connection with science. And if you think about how much the world has changed in the last 60 or 70 years, we didn't even have computers, let alone cell phones. And so if you don't find a way to continuously talk to people about the big changes in a technocratic society, then you're going to find people who are left behind. And that's got all sorts of trickle-down problems for jobs, for employability, for understanding issues that matter, for all sorts of national and local reasons. And so the point is, how do you connect with a group of people that aren't seeking out that information already? People who don't go to museums or don't read, the science section of the newspaper. And the answer we came up with is you need to go where the people are. And that's why we find ourselves at music festivals. It's the last place you'd expect to learn about science.
So I don't get it, Mark. On one hand, you have goals of, informal science education and informing the public and not leaving anyone behind. On the other hand, you're an anarchist. You want to bring this carnival feeling to different places and maybe challenge science with all these weird ideas. How does this go together?
I think that's an interesting question. I'm not sure that I'm an anarchist, but what I do think is true is that it's important to empower people to be critical consumers of
Hmm.
information. And we do live in a society that has got a dominant discourse of science. Um, we live in a society that really does, in some contexts, value science uncritically. Now, I'm a scientist. I trained as a scientist. That's my life's work. So it's not that science isn't an incredible force for good, but it has problems and it could be better. And I think it's important to challenge those. And one of the really powerful ways to do that is to look for situations where you can challenge hierarchies and dominant discourses. And you know, music festivals and places where people go to enjoy and express themselves are really good places to do that.
Hmm. So guerrilla science events are collaborative efforts. It involves scientists and artists and performance. What do each of these bring to the table? How do they collaborate?
That's a really fascinating question. So I tend to think about this through the lens of kind of transdisciplinarity. So transdisciplinarity is this idea that you can have nominally disparate subjects coming together to create something that's greater than the sum of the parts. So if you look at technical fields, an example of a transdisciplinary field would be something like biodesign or synthetic biology. Or if you look back in history, a lot of digital arts, computing, that actually grew out of the coming together of makers and, you know, digital artists and designers, along with computer scientists and before that time mathematicians. So I think a lot of the real value in the work we do is bringing together this um, mixing pot or a melting pot of people who don't normally work together and giving it a bit of a shake and see what happens. So some examples of where that works out really well is when we bring together performance artists or people with a theatrical disposition with content specialists like scientists or people who have a deep understanding of either specific subject matters or how it affects society. And the results of that are all sorts of events that we do. So one I particularly like is this event called Lab Rats, which looks at the ethical implications of animal experimentation without really taking a position on it. And the conceit of the event is that people navigate their way through a maze using only their sense of smell. But the maze is staffed by giant rats. So people in rat costumes. And it's the idea of flipping it on its head, flipping the idea of animal experimentation on its head. Are you smarter than a rat is the question. And it's just really meant to look at, you know, what is it about rats that make them such relevant subjects for biomedical research?
Yeah. It has a Douglas Adams feel to it,
Oh
walking in a
yeah,
maze.
definitely.
But,
Yeah,
but
I tend to think of Carnival, you know, these medieval celebrations a lot when I think about this.
so beyond the entertainment and the exposure that people get to science, what are some of the medium and long-term impacts of these events? Do you actually aim to have medium or long-term impacts?
You know, that's a really great question, and I'm going to kind of answer it on two levels. So on one level, we do aim to have medium and long-term impacts, and we actually look at this very seriously. I spend a lot of time working with social scientists and learning scientists to see if we can measure what the impacts are. So in a recent study that we published, we looked at the effect of a music festival program on public audiences, and we found that these audiences came to the event because they were interested in what the activities were, but they actually took away some science knowledge. And then in the long term, so we followed up with them about 6 months later, and a significant percentage of them had gone on to do something different, like read an article or visit a museum. So we do aim to have these sort of impacts, but I want to be kind of taking another tack. I want to be kind of a bit of a realist about the effect of not just what we do, but most of informal science learning. It's very, very hard to measure. And it's actually also very hard to attribute any specific event to a big life outcome. So I think it's important to just bear that in mind and have some realism or humility about the kind of outcomes you can expect to see for any project.
Well, although it sounds very hard and very time consuming, you got me hooked. I really want to collaborate with artists and performers to design an event. What are some best practices I should keep in mind?
That's a really good question. So I think a lot about expectation management when you're forming collaborations. I think that's a really important skill. It's to go into it with outcomes that are both realistic in mind and also communicating those clearly to the people you're working with. So I tend to find that promising the moon to my line manager or my funders and then being unable to deliver is a recipe for disaster. And a much more realistic way to put it is to talk about the process and the importance of the process with being a little more agnostic about the outcome.
Huh.
Now, I know for at least physical scientists like myself, it's very counterintuitive and difficult to be relaxed about outcomes. We're used to writing grant proposals where we say, we'll deliver this, we'll do this experiment. But that's actually not often the way that artists and creatives work. For them, it's much more about the process.
Interesting. Okay. Being agnostic about the outcome. Okay, Professor Mark Rosen, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. That was very valuable.
Thank you for having me.